December 1939. British headlines are filled with a mystery. Where is the Altmark?
When Nazi Germany collapsed, the world waited for justice, but instead, some of its most feared leaders disappeared like smoke. Behind closed doors, secret escape routes, hidden allies, and false identities were already in motion. How could the most wanted men on Earth live freely for decades, hiding in plain sight? The truth is more shocking than you can imagine, and it's all about to be revealed. By early 1945, the vision of a 1,000-year Reich had shrunk to a few battered streets in Berlin. For 12 years, Nazi Germany had reshaped the political and moral landscape of Europe through an iron grip of propaganda, conquest, and terror. Now Soviet artillery thundered closer each day, and the Allied forces pressed in from every side. The once sprawling empire was reduced to pockets of resistance, each one surrounded by advancing armies that would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. The atmosphere in Germany's remaining strongholds was one of both fatalism and frantic planning. Civilians cowered in bomb shelters, while the party elite scrambled to save themselves from what they knew was coming. Years of atrocities had made it clear that if captured, they would face trials unlike any the world had seen before. This was not a war that could end with negotiated peace or honorable exile. It would end with evidence, testimony, and judgment. As the walls closed in, Berlin itself became a crucible of desperation. The city's once grand streets were reduced to rubble. Blackened shells of buildings lined the avenues, their facades ripped away by air raids. The smell of smoke and ash mixed with the cold spring air, while in the underground stations and makeshift shelters, whispers carried of senior officials already disappearing, their uniforms traded for civilian clothes, their names replaced by invented ones. In the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler surrounded himself with the last circle of loyalists, many of whom knew the end was near, but stayed out of fear or sheer inertia. The atmosphere was tense and surreal. Orders were given for counterattacks that could never happen. Maps were studied that no longer matched the reality above ground. Beyond Berlin, Germany's rail network became a lifeline for those attempting to vanish. Trains leaving the capital carried not only refugees but also carefully hidden members of the Nazi hierarchy. The Reich's bureaucracy, notorious for its efficiency in wartime, now turned its skills toward the art of disappearance. Forged papers, smuggled gold, and sympathetic contacts in distant lands were all part of a final desperate gamble. The chaos was fertile ground for escape. In cities newly captured by Allied forces, the priority was to establish order, provide food, and restore basic services. That left gaps in which individuals with the right knowledge and resources could vanish before their names appeared on official lists. Some melted into rural Germany, blending with displaced persons. Others sought safe passage to ports, aiming for neutral countries or even continents away. For the Allied leadership, the scale of the Nazi regime's crimes was only beginning to be understood. Reports from liberated concentration camps painted a picture of industrialized murder on a scale unimaginable before. This knowledge intensified the urgency to capture those responsible. Yet for the fugitives, the horror of their crimes was precisely what drove them to act quickly and decisively. They knew the sentences awaiting them would be death or lifelong imprisonment. Among the escapees were figures whose names would later become synonymous with genocide. Some had planned their exits long before the first Soviet shells landed in Berlin. Hidden routes through the Alps, contacts in sympathetic embassies, and even clergy willing to provide sanctuary were all parts of elaborate escape mechanisms that would later be known as the rat lines. The fall of the Reich was not a single moment but a series of disintegrations. Town after town fell to Allied troops. Communications broke down. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. In the cities, food ran short, electricity failed, and disease spread. For ordinary Germans, it was the end of a war that had cost them homes, families, and a sense of national stability. For the Nazi elite, it was the beginning of a different kind of war, one fought in the shadows, relying on falsehood, cunning, and the ability to disappear completely. Berlin finally surrendered in May 1945. The formal act of Germany's unconditional surrender was signed in Reims and again in Berlin to satisfy both Western and Soviet command. The war in Europe was officially over, but even as celebrations erupted in London, Paris, and New York, another story was already unfolding. It was a story without the clarity of military victory, one in which the pursuit of justice would be slow, uncertain, and often incomplete. While Allied governments prepared for the monumental legal proceedings that would become the Nuremberg trials, they also faced a troubling reality. Some of the most important perpetrators were no longer in custody. They had used the confusion of war's end to slip away, and their whereabouts were unknown. The hunt had begun, but the hunters were not the only ones planning their moves. The hunted still had resources, and they were prepared to use them. What would drive one of Hitler's most powerful men to vanish without a trace? Stay with us to know. Himmler's Vanishing Act. In the turbulent final months of the Third Reich, Heinrich Himmler stood at the pinnacle of both power and notoriety. As head of the SS, he had overseen a sprawling empire within an empire, an organization with its own armed forces, intelligence services, and a network of concentration camps that reached deep into occupied Europe. The machinery of mass murder he had constructed ran with the precision of an industry, and he was its undisputed master. Yet by the start of 1945, the man once feared above almost all others had begun to see the writing on the wall. The first cracks in his loyalty to Hitler appeared as the front lines collapsed. With Soviet forces pushing into East Prussia and Allied troops advancing from the west, Himmler quietly explored an idea that would have been unthinkable months earlier: making contact with the enemy. He sought to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, a move designed to preserve what remained of Germany and, perhaps more importantly, himself. In his calculations, an arrangement that excluded the Soviets might spare him from their retribution. Those secret overtures, however, were doomed from the outset. The Western Allies had already agreed with Stalin that Germany would surrender unconditionally. Any hint of backroom dealings with one of Hitler's lieutenants was treated with suspicion and outright rejection. Once word of Himmler's approach reached the Führer, the reaction was explosive. Hitler, already consumed by paranoia and convinced of betrayal at every turn, regarded this as the ultimate treachery. From that moment, Himmler's position inside the collapsing Reich was untenable. Stripped of authority and facing arrest, he slipped away from the chaos of Berlin. Unlike other officials who fled openly towards safe zones, Himmler vanished into a carefully planned route. Disguised in the uniform of a common soldier, he blended with retreating units and streams of refugees moving through the war-torn countryside. Traveling westward, he carried forged identity papers under the name Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger. Every step took him further from the seat of Nazi power and deeper into anonymity. For the man who had commanded armies, dictated policy, and orchestrated genocide, the disguise was both a humiliation and a survival tactic. He avoided large towns, moved mostly at night, and relied on a small circle of loyal SS aides who had remained at his side. The countryside in those weeks was a shifting sea of humanity. Former soldiers, displaced civilians, and liberated prisoners crisscrossed the roads. Amid this confusion, Himmler's true identity remained hidden. Yet the risk was constant. Any checkpoint, any curious guard could expose him. For a man accustomed to absolute authority, the need to keep his eyes down and voice low must have been a jarring reversal. By mid-May 1945, Germany had officially surrendered. Allied patrols swept the countryside, searching for high-ranking Nazis on the run. Himmler and his small party reached the northern city of Bremerwörde, where British troops maintained control. It was here, in a routine security inspection, that his carefully constructed disguise began to unravel. A British officer examining his papers noted inconsistencies and ordered a more thorough check. Taken into custody, Himmler still hoped to conceal his identity long enough to negotiate leniency. But during the search, a concealed document was found that linked him directly to the SS High Command. The British, now certain of who they had, placed him under guard. In an attempt to prevent him from influencing other prisoners, he was kept isolated. The end came swiftly. While in British custody at Lüneburg, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth, dying before he could be brought to trial. The man whose name had become synonymous with the SS and its reign of terror had evaded formal justice, leaving historians and survivors to grapple with the fact that some of the worst perpetrators would never stand in the dock at Nuremberg. His disappearance and brief re-emergence as a captured fugitive underscored the scale of the post-war challenge. If a figure as infamous as Himmler could vanish into the crowd, what chance did the Allies have of locating the many lesser-known but equally guilty officials who had the advantage of obscurity? In the aftermath of his death, attention shifted quickly to the next names on the list, men who were already well on their way to safety far from European soil. How did the death of one leader inside a bunker set off a wave of escapes that would shape the entire hunt for Nazi fugitives? Come with us to know. Death in the bunker. The spring of 1945 found Berlin transformed into a fortress of desperation. Above ground, Soviet shells tore through streets lined with smouldering ruins. Below ground, the Führer bunker became both a command post and a tomb in waiting. Adolf Hitler, who had once strode across Europe as its conqueror, now spent his final days surrounded by exhaustion, paranoia, and the smell of damp concrete. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was claustrophobic and unreal. Days blurred into nights as maps were studied that no longer reflected the reality outside. Couriers brought news of collapsing fronts, and each update pushed the remaining loyalists closer to despair. Conversations turned from military strategy to questions of loyalty, betrayal, and the manner of their inevitable ends. Amid this decay, an unusual moment of ceremony unfolded. On 29th April 1945, in a small room lit by dim electric bulbs, Hitler married Eva Braun, his companion of over a decade. Witnessed by a handful of aides, the wedding was conducted quickly, almost perfunctorily, as though both parties knew it was a formality before their chosen fate. Champagne was poured, yet even in celebration the air was heavy with the knowledge that there would be no future to share. The following day, Soviet artillery roared ever closer. Reports confirmed that the Red Army had reached within blocks of the Reich Chancellery. Hitler met with his military staff for the last time, handing out instructions that no one believed could be carried out. After the meeting, he withdrew to his private quarters with Eva Braun. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the sharp crack of a pistol echoed through the corridors. Guards stationed outside rushed in to find Hitler slumped lifeless, a pistol at his side, and Eva Braun motionless from cyanide poisoning. The scene was grim, but the orders were clear. No Soviet soldier was to lay hands on their bodies. Loyal SS adjutants carried the corpses up to what remained of the garden above the bunker. The ground was cratered from days of shelling, yet they poured petrol over the bodies and set them alight. Flames rose into the grey sky, a macabre pyre intended to erase all trace of the Führer and his bride. It was a desperate attempt to deny the enemy a trophy and to control the narrative of his death. For those who remained in the bunker, the act was both a release and a signal. The man who had commanded them was gone. Survival now depended on individual decisions, not loyalty to a vanished leader. Some officers prepared to fight their way through Soviet lines. Others sought disguises or false papers to melt into the flood of civilians outside. A few, knowing their names would be high on Allied lists, began mapping escape routes that would take them far beyond the borders of a ruined Germany. Outside, Soviet troops closed in. The streets above the bunker were filled with debris, abandoned weapons, and the smell of burning fuel. Berlin's defenders were surrendering in their pockets, and the last resistance crumbled within hours. Yet within that moment of total defeat, the chaos provided a kind of cover. In the confusion, it was possible for determined fugitives to slip away unnoticed, their absence unremarked until much later. The death of Hitler also altered the psychology of the hunt that would follow. Without him, the Allies could focus on capturing those who had enforced and enacted his policies. Figures like Goering, Himmler, and Bormann became priority targets. But many others, less famous yet equally culpable, were already making their way to ports, safe houses, and sympathetic contacts in foreign embassies. The bunker's final hours, marked by ritual, suicide, and fire, became the prelude to a new chapter of history. It was no longer about the rise and fall of a regime. The story had shifted to one of pursuit of justice sought across continents, and of men determined to deny that justice by any means available. How could a simple declaration from 1943 become the most feared promise to Nazi leaders on the run? Let us tell you. The Moscow Declaration. In November 1943, while the war still raged across Europe, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union gathered in Moscow to shape the course of victory and the peace that would follow. Among the strategic discussions and military planning, one statement emerged that was aimed not at armies, but at individuals. It would later send a chill through the upper echelons of Nazi Germany. This was the Moscow Declaration on Atrocities. In blunt, uncompromising language, it declared that those responsible for war crimes would be hunted to the utmost ends of the earth and brought to justice in the very countries where their crimes had been committed. It was not merely a threat, it was a pledge from the most powerful Allied nations, made while the war's outcome was becoming increasingly clear. To the ordinary listener in occupied Europe, it was a signal of hope. It told the persecuted and the oppressed that their suffering would not be forgotten, that the architects of their misery would not simply melt away when the fighting stopped. For the Nazi leadership, however, it was a different kind of message. It was a warning that their positions would not shield them, that even those who might survive the battlefield could still be called to account. As the declaration spread through occupied territories, it began to influence behavior on both sides. Some perpetrators, aware that their names might be recorded and reported, became more careful in leaving direct evidence of their actions. Others doubled down, reasoning that if they were destined to face trial, they might as well carry out their orders with ruthless efficiency until the end. In Berlin, the significance of the Moscow Declaration was not lost on Hitler's inner circle. Ministers and military commanders discussed it behind closed doors, often dismissing it as Allied propaganda, yet privately taking note of the potential consequences. Those with the foresight to plan for defeat began quietly preparing escape routes, establishing contacts abroad, and securing resources that could fund a new life far from Europe. By the time the Reich began to crumble in 1945, the words of the declaration had taken on an almost prophetic weight. Allied officers, newly arrived in liberated cities, carried lists of wanted men, names supplied by resistance networks, survivors, and captured documents. Some of these men were already gone, having used the chaos of retreat to vanish. Others were still in place, clinging to the hope that the war might take a turn in their favor. The promise embedded in the Moscow Declaration shaped the framework for what would become the Nuremberg trials. It established the principle that individuals, not just governments, could be held accountable for crimes committed in war. This was a profound shift in international law, one that set a precedent for decades to come. Yet for all its strength, the declaration also faced a harsh reality. The war's end would unleash a flood of displaced persons, refugees, and demobilized soldiers across the continent. Amid such movement, tracking down every suspect was a monumental task. In the confusion, some fugitives managed to cross borders unchallenged, armed with new names and convincing stories. For those determined to evade capture, the declaration was a constant reminder of the danger. Every checkpoint, every stranger's question carried the risk of exposure. The fear of the utmost ends of the earth was not an abstract idea. It was a tangible threat that followed them through crowded ports, over mountain passes, and across oceans. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers used the declaration as both a legal and moral tool. When they confronted suspects, they cited its promise, reminding them that there was no safe harbor for the guilty. Sometimes this persuaded the accused to confess, hoping for leniency. More often, it drove them further into hiding, determined to test whether the Allies truly meant what they had declared in Moscow. For some, the pursuit would be swift and decisive. For others, it would drag on for decades, as the words from 1943 echoed into the post-war world. The Moscow Declaration had promised a reckoning. What it could not guarantee was that every fugitive would be found before time, politics, or death took them beyond the reach of the law. What happens when the man who ran Auschwitz trades his command for a spade in a quiet garden? Stay with us to find out. Hunt for the Auschwitz Commandant. A gentle spring breeze rustled the hedges of a quiet German farmhouse. In the garden, a man stooped over the soil, his hands caked in dirt as he worked silently with a spade. To a passing stranger, he might have seemed no different from thousands of other men trying to rebuild their lives after the war. But beneath the plain clothes and humble routine was one of the most feared names in the history of the Nazi regime, Rudolf Höss, the former commandant of Auschwitz. During the war, Höss had overseen the transformation of Auschwitz into the largest and most efficient killing center in occupied Europe. His meticulous attention to detail ensured that the machinery of death operated with industrial precision. Trains arrived on schedule, selections were made within minutes, and the gas chambers were run at maximum capacity. By his own admission, over 1 million people perished under his command. When the Reich collapsed in May 1945, Höss did not flee to South America or seek refuge with sympathetic governments abroad. Instead, he relied on the simplest form of disguise, becoming someone else entirely within his own country. He took the name Franz Lang, claimed to be a low-ranking naval officer returning to civilian life, and found work as a farmhand in northern Germany. His once razor-sharp uniform was replaced by worn trousers and work shirts. His authority traded for anonymity. For months, the deception held. The Allies, still sorting through the chaos of occupation, were focused on capturing the most visible leaders of the regime. While Höss was certainly high on the list of wanted men, his physical transformation and remote location shielded him from immediate detection. Neighbors saw only a quiet man who kept to himself and worked long hours in the fields. The turning point came not from a sudden slip in his cover, but from a piece of information that reached British military intelligence. Somewhere in the countryside, a family was sheltering a man whose description matched the former commandant. Investigators traced the lead to the farm where Franz Lang had been living, but when they arrived, the man they sought denied everything. British officers, trained to look for the smallest inconsistencies, noticed his reluctance to meet their eyes and his oddly measured answers. The real breakthrough came when they searched his belongings. Among his few possessions was a wedding ring. Inside, engraved in small but unmistakable letters, was the name Rudolf Höss. Confronted with the evidence, Höss remained silent. His wife, who had been living nearby under similar cover, proved less composed under questioning. Terrified of what might happen to her and their children, she admitted the truth of her husband's identity. That confession removed the last shred of doubt. Höss was taken into custody, and for the first time since the fall of the Reich, the man who had orchestrated mass murder at Auschwitz stood before his captors. Eyewitnesses later described the arrest as almost surreal. The once commanding figure appeared shrunken, avoiding the gaze of the tall British officer who read out the charges against him. The scene was a stark reversal of the power he had once wielded, a man who had controlled the fates of millions reduced to a silent prisoner. From there, Höss was handed over to Polish authorities, whose people had borne the brunt of the atrocities committed at Auschwitz. In Warsaw, his trial drew intense public attention. Survivors testified about the selections, the forced labor, the starvation, and the gas chambers. Höss himself gave a detailed confession, outlining the logistics of the extermination process with the same detachment he might have used to describe running a factory. The court had little difficulty reaching its verdict. Found guilty of crimes against humanity, Höss was sentenced to death. In April 1947, he was executed by hanging fittingly on the grounds of Auschwitz, within sight of the crematorium chimneys that had belched smoke under his command. His capture and trial became a model for how Allied forces and liberated nations might track, prosecute, and punish those who had attempted to disappear into the wreckage of post-war Europe. Yet even with this success, Huss's case also highlighted a troubling truth. If one of the most notorious war criminals in history could live undetected for months within Germany itself, how many others had already made their way beyond the reach of European justice? How could a man responsible for millions of deaths slip across borders and oceans without a trace? You will want to hear this. Eichmann's secret voyage. In the shadowed corridors of post-war Europe, Adolf Eichmann's name carried a weight that could condemn him on sight. Known to history as the architect of the final solution, he had not merely followed orders. He had refined them into an organized system of deportations and exterminations that stripped millions of their lives. For a man whose notoriety was destined to echo for generations, vanishing would require more than false papers and luck. It would demand planning, patience, and a network of willing hands. Eichmann's first opportunity came in 1946, less than a year after Germany's surrender. At that time, his name was not yet as widely recognized among Allied authorities as it would later become. Captured by American forces, he was placed in an internment camp. The guards saw only a low-ranking officer, not the bureaucrat who had orchestrated genocide. Using this misjudgment to his advantage, he slipped away, disappearing into the ruins of northern Germany. From there, Eichmann adopted a series of temporary identities. He worked briefly in forestry, then leased a small piece of land for farming. His appearance changed to a shaven moustache, altered hairstyle, and plain workman's clothes. To his neighbors, he was unremarkable, a man just trying to earn a living in the shattered economy. Beneath that exterior, however, he was quietly making arrangements for a far more ambitious escape. Europe in those years was a patchwork of destroyed infrastructure, divided authority, and black market opportunities. For fugitives like Eichmann, it was fertile ground. Networks sympathetic to former Nazis, some formed during the war, now operated as escape routes. Known later as the Rat Lines, they were sustained by priests, ex-soldiers, and political allies scattered across the continent. Eichmann's route took him through a chain of monasteries that doubled as safe houses. Each offered temporary shelter, food, and forged identity documents. These stops were not chosen at random. They were part of a discreet system maintained by clergy who viewed their assistance as an act of loyalty to old political ideals or as a charitable duty to a man in need. The monks and priests often asked a few questions, trusting the intermediaries who brought him to their doors. In candlelit rooms, Eichmann was handed travel papers bearing new names, while whispered instructions directed him to the next waypoint. At times, he moved under the cover of night, avoiding main roads where Allied patrols were active. In rural villages, he blended into processions of displaced people, his small bag and weathered clothing disguising the fact that he was one of the most wanted men in Europe. The journey was deliberate, calculated, and patient, each step taking him closer to a continent's edge and the promise of a new life across the ocean. The most critical document came in 1948, a falsified Red Cross passport. It bore the name Ricardo Clement, an identity that would soon be known to intelligence agencies across the world. The passport was secured with the help of Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, a figure infamous for aiding Nazi fugitives. With this in hand, Eichmann could travel as a displaced European, one of many seeking new lives overseas. By 1949, the plan was ready to unfold. Eichmann made his way to the Italian port city of Genoa, a hub where ships bound for South America departed regularly. Posing as a refugee from the turmoil in Eastern Europe, he boarded an Italian passenger liner. The voyage lasted weeks, carrying him across the Atlantic to Argentina, a country whose government, under Juan Perón, maintained policies sympathetic to European immigrants, including former Nazis. Arriving in Buenos Aires in July 1949, Eichmann stepped onto the dock not as a hunted war criminal, but as Ricardo Clement, an anonymous technician seeking work. The transformation was complete. In the sprawling Argentine capital, where thousands of European immigrants mingled freely, his past dissolved into the crowd. Life under his new identity was humble but stable. Eichmann found employment at a Mercedes-Benz automotive plant, lived in modest housing, and kept his circle of acquaintances small. He avoided political discussions and shunned any contact with other known fugitives whose recognition might compromise him. His neighbors saw only a quiet man devoted to his work and family, never suspecting the history he carried. For more than a decade, the disguise held. The name Adolf Eichmann became infamous at the Nuremberg trials and in survivor testimonies, but the man himself remained an ocean away, invisible to those searching for him. The world believed him either dead or buried deep within Europe's refugee chaos. What Eichmann could not foresee was the persistence of those who had survived his policies. Among them were individuals who dedicated their lives to tracking Nazi fugitives, working with both official and unofficial channels. In the mid-1950s, whispers began to circulate within the Jewish community in Argentina, stories of a quiet man living under a false name whose habits and accent seemed out of place. These whispers would eventually make their way to Israeli intelligence, setting in motion a pursuit unlike any other. For now, though, Eichmann lived freely, walking the streets of Buenos Aires with the confidence of a man who believed his past was forever buried across the Atlantic. What happens when the hunters finally close in on a man who believes himself untouchable? You may be surprised by how it unfolds. The Buenos Aires kidnapping. For over a decade, Ricardo Clement lived a life so ordinary it barely raised an eyebrow. A factory foreman by day, he took the same bus, walked the same streets, and returned to a modest home on Garibaldi Street. But this routine hid a dark secret. Ricardo Clement was just a mask. Beneath it was Adolf Eichmann, the mastermind behind the final solution, whose quiet existence was on the brink of unraveling. The trail to Eichmann began years earlier with scattered clues. Survivors who had fled Europe carried memories sharper than any official record. Some recalled Eichmann's face, others remembered his voice or mannerisms. A few, now living in Argentina, noticed details in the behavior of a quiet neighbor, a German accent that did not match his claimed background, or a reluctance to discuss the past. These observations alone were not proof, but they were enough to spark whispers that eventually reached the Israeli consulate in Vienna. In 1954, a report landed on the desk of Israeli intelligence officials suggesting that Eichmann might be in Argentina. It was not the first such claim, but the persistence of certain details, the location, the alias, the routine, made it harder to dismiss. Investigators began piecing together fragments of information: immigration records, photographs from post-war Europe, and witness statements. Slowly, the mosaic began to take shape. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, took the lead. The stakes were high. Bringing Eichmann to trial would not only satisfy a moral debt to the victims of the Holocaust, it would demonstrate that Nazi war criminals could not hide forever. Yet this was no simple arrest. Argentina had not agreed to extradite suspected Nazis, and any open operation risked a diplomatic crisis. The mission would need to be clandestine, swift, and precise. By early 1960, a small team of operatives was dispatched to Buenos Aires. Their first task was surveillance. They studied the house on Garibaldi Street, noting the comings and goings of its inhabitants. They watched Eichmann's route from home to the bus stop, memorizing his timings. Patience became their shield. The longer they observed without acting, the more they learned about his vulnerabilities. Weeks of observation revealed a consistent pattern. Eichmann returned from work at the same hour, walking along a stretch of road with little traffic and few pedestrians. This would be the moment to strike, away from witnesses before he could raise an alarm. On the evening of May 11th, 1960, the plan moved into action. Operatives positioned themselves along his route, appearing to be ordinary passers-by. As Eichmann approached, one member of the team stepped into his path while another came from behind. The grab was sudden but controlled. A brief struggle ended with him being bundled into a waiting car. No shots were fired, no shouts echoed down the street. In less than a minute, the architect of mass murder had vanished from his own life. He was taken to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, where he was held in complete secrecy. Here, the operatives confirmed his identity through questioning and cross-referencing with historical records. Eichmann, perhaps realizing the inevitability of his fate, offered little resistance beyond initial denial. The next challenge was getting him out of Argentina without detection. The opportunity came with an upcoming Israeli diplomatic flight returning from Argentina's 150th anniversary celebrations. Drugged to appear unconscious, Eichmann was dressed in the uniform of an airline crew member and given forged travel documents. Under this guise, he was carried aboard the plane and flown to Israel. The operation stunned the world. Argentina protested the breach of its sovereignty, but Israel stood firm, arguing that the scale of Eichmann's crimes demanded extraordinary measures. Public opinion in many countries leaned in Israel's favor. The image of a long-hunted war criminal finally facing justice resonated far beyond the Jewish community. In April 1961, Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem. The courtroom, broadcast to audiences worldwide, became a stage for survivors to recount their experiences and for the world to confront the realities of the Holocaust. Eichmann, seated in a glass booth for his own protection, claimed he had only followed orders, denying personal responsibility for the policies he had executed. The verdict was inevitable. In December 1961, he was found guilty on multiple counts, including crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people. The sentence was death. On June 1, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was executed by hanging, his ashes scattered at sea to ensure no grave could become a shrine. The mission to capture Eichmann had shown that even across oceans and decades, justice could reach those who believed themselves untouchable. But it also underscored a sobering truth. Not all fugitives would be found in time, and some were still out there, living under new names in distant lands. What kind of disguise could protect the most notorious doctor of Auschwitz from the eyes of the world? You will want to hear this. Mengele's disguise. In the grim catalogue of names associated with Auschwitz, Josef Mengele stands apart. Known as the Angel of Death, he was both a doctor and a destroyer, blending medical authority with cruelty that defied comprehension. His selections on the arrival ramps determined who would live and who would die. His experiments on prisoners, twins, pregnant women, children inflicted suffering that lingered long after the victims were gone. By the end of the war, his reputation among survivors was that of a figure almost mythic in horror. When the Third Reich collapsed, Mengele knew that capture meant certain execution. In April 1945, he abandoned his post in Auschwitz and joined a retreating military unit. He carried forged identification, naming him as a Wehrmacht soldier, a role far less likely to draw immediate suspicion than that of an SS officer. In the chaos of surrender, this deception worked. He was detained briefly by American forces but released without recognition, his name not yet high on Allied priority lists. This unexpected stroke of fortune gave him time. Mengele retreated into rural Bavaria, moving between farms and safe houses. He changed his appearance subtly but effectively. A clean-shaven face replaced his wartime mustache, hair was cropped shorter, clothing was kept plain and workmanlike. He avoided major towns where veterans' gossip or a newspaper photograph might betray him. As Allied investigations into concentration camp crimes intensified, Mengele's name began climbing the lists of wanted men. The Nuremberg trials exposed the scale of medical atrocities committed in the camps, and survivors testified in detail about his presence. With the net tightening, Mengele prepared for a longer escape, one that would take him far from European soil. Like Eichmann, he turned to the underground network, later dubbed the Rat Lines. These channels relied heavily on sympathetic priests, former Nazi sympathizers, and well-connected intermediaries who could provide both shelter and documents. In 1949, under the alias Helmut Gregor, Mengele obtained a Red Cross travel document. The new name came with a fabricated backstory. He was a German national displaced by the upheaval in Central Europe. His destination was Argentina. Under President Juan Perón's immigration policies, European arrivals faced minimal scrutiny, and the government quietly welcomed individuals with technical skills or political sympathies aligned with their own. In Buenos Aires, Helmut Gregor blended into the immigrant community. He lived modestly at first, working as a carpenter's assistant before investing in a small machinery business. For nearly a decade, he moved freely in Argentine society. Mengele attended social gatherings, cultivated business contacts, and even maintained correspondence with family members in Germany. Those who met him saw only a polite, soft-spoken man with an interest in agriculture and engineering. Few suspected the enormity of his past. Yet as Eichmann's capture in 1960 made headlines worldwide, Mengele's sense of safety began to erode. He abandoned his home and business in Buenos Aires, fearing that Israeli intelligence might come for him next. Crossing into Paraguay, he secured citizenship with the help of political allies and continued to operate under assumed names. The disguise evolved with each move. He grew a fuller head of hair, added weight, and adopted local styles of dress. In Brazil, where he eventually settled, he lived on remote farms and kept social contact to a minimum. Years of manual labor and exposure to the sun altered his appearance further, making him nearly unrecognizable from the man in wartime photographs. Despite international arrest warrants and coordinated searches, Mengele eluded capture for the rest of his life. Multiple reported sightings led to dead ends. Those who sheltered him often denied knowing his true identity. He remained a ghost in plain sight, close enough to civilization to maintain a life, yet far enough from scrutiny to avoid the justice so many sought. In 1979, while swimming off the Brazilian coast, Mengele suffered a fatal stroke and drowned. For years, his death remained unconfirmed, with rumors placing him in Paraguay, Uruguay, or even deep within the Amazon. It was only in 1985, after the exhumation and forensic testing of his remains, that the truth emerged. The angel of death had been buried under a false name for 6 years. What kind of path leads from the jungles of Paraguay to a hidden life in Brazil? The answer may surprise you. From Paraguay to Brazil. After Eichmann's capture in 1960, Argentina was no longer safe for Josef Mengele. He fled to Paraguay, where dictator Alfredo Stroessner sheltered Nazi fugitives in exchange for loyalty and money. Under a false identity, Mengele gained citizenship, kept a low profile on rural properties, and cultivated allies in government. By the early 1970s, rumors of his presence and growing scrutiny drove him to vanish again, this time to Brazil. In 1974, aided by German expatriates Gitta and Wolfgang Gerhard, he took Wolfgang's name and settled on remote farms. Rural life changed his appearance, and he avoided all contact with high-profile fugitives, communicating with family only through intermediaries. Though he enjoyed deep obscurity, the fear of discovery persisted. Interpol's warrant remained active, and each rumor sent him deeper into hiding. In 1979, while swimming off Bertioga, he suffered a fatal stroke and drowned. Buried under Wolfgang Gerhard, his death went unnoticed for 6 years. Death as Wolfgang Gerhard. In the cemetery of Embu, Brazil, a modest grave marked Wolfgang Gerhard concealed one of history's most wanted men. For 6 years, only the Gerhards, his protectors, knew it held Josef Mengele. In 1985, tips led West German authorities to the couple, who revealed the truth. Forensic tests, dental, bone, scars, confirmed the body was Mengele's. The world was shocked not by his capture, but by the fact he had been dead for years while the manhunt continued. Survivors were denied a trial. Others saw the revelation as closure. Questions lingered. How had he evaded capture so long, and how many others had died under false names? The Gerhards faced no charges, insisting they'd acted out of loyalty. Mengele's remains were later studied for forensic training, then cremated in 2016. No grave, no monument, no shrine. His story endures as proof that justice can be delayed, denied, and deceived. The end of the manhunts. In the years after World War II, the hunt for Nazi war criminals was relentless. Names like Eichmann, Mengele, and Höss topped Allied wanted lists, with governments, agencies, and private citizens investing heavily in the chase. But by the mid-1950s, the pace slowed. The Cold War shifted priorities. Resources moved toward countering the Soviet threat. Some fugitives gained protection for their skills, as in Operation Paperclip, where Nazi-linked scientists were brought to the US for military projects. Public attention also waned. Headlines moved from Nazi hideouts to political crises. Many fugitives lived freely for decades, Klaus Barbie in South America, others dying quietly under false names. International cooperation fractured, with disputes over jurisdiction and cost. A few, like Simon Wiesenthal, pressed on, capturing some long after others had given up. But time proved the best ally of the hunted. Witnesses died, records vanished, and prosecutions became harder. Eventually, governments accepted some names would never be crossed off. Yet the legacy remains. Eichmann's capture showed fugitives could be found, while others' escapes warn that justice delayed can become justice denied. Justice denied. For Holocaust survivors, unpunished war criminals were living proof of broken promises. Mengele, Brunner, Rauff, and others lived out their days in safety, some protected by political convenience or authoritarian regimes. Cases were dropped to avoid diplomatic conflict, files shelved not for lack of guilt but lack of will. Time eroded evidence and testimony. Defense lawyers exploited fading memories, and trials that might have affirmed history never came. Survivors sought not vengeance, but acknowledgement. Yet without trials, that validation was lost. Public interest faded as World War II shifted from memory to history, with some arguing the men were too old to try. To survivors, age did not erase atrocity. Many fugitives died believing they'd beaten the system, a moral wound that lingered. These failures showed how easily politics can outweigh principle, and how quickly justice's trail grows cold. For those still pursuing war criminals, the lesson is clear. The hunt must be relentless, for time is the greatest shield of the guilty. Were you stunned by the cunning and relentless methods these senior Nazi soldiers used to evade justice for decades? Which escape shocked you the most or revealed something you never knew before? Share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below.